Chairman Mao created modern China. But it was Deng Xiaoping who built modern China, both its political process and its economic machinery. But Deng's rise to the top was anything but smooth. It was only after the death of country's founder, Mao Zedong, that Deng Xiaoping was able to claw his way back to the top from where he masterfully ran China for almost 2 decades. Along the way, he faced power struggles from his chosen successor. It threatened to even weaken his iron grip over the party. But a crafty Deng Xiaoping managed to blunt any political challenge. Despite being his trusted deputy, Mao Zedong never appointed Deng Xiaoping as his successor, even though he had demonstrated both administrative skills and financial acumen in the mid-1960s. Instead, Chairman Mao repeatedly purged him for what he believed were his rightist tendencies. Deng Xiaoping had famously said, "Watch out for the rightists, but be more careful about the leftists." In 1976, Deng Xiaoping made his final comeback to active politics, and by 1978, he had successfully sidelined Mao's chosen successor, Hua Guofeng. Soon, Deng emerged as the supreme leader. In China, real power centers are the heads of the military and the Communist Party, and both these were firmly under Deng Xiaoping's control. So despite not being the president of China, Deng Xiaoping was the final authority and left his stamp on the very fabric of modern China. This arrangement remained even after he had relinquished all posts until his death in 1997. In its post-Mao phase that was riddled with both poverty and corruption, Deng Xiaoping dismantled the agricultural communes that formed the backbone of Mao's economic vision. As Deng undid Mao's planned economy, he brought down the godlike status of the leader and admitted that the famine and the Cultural Revolution were 2 of Mao's biggest failures.
So Deng Xiaoping was very much a realist, and as far as economic policy goes, from the beginning of the PRC, starting in the 1940s, he was in the faction that was in favor of more gradual efforts to communize the economy and socialize. So, for example, when Mao Zedong started pushing for very, very rapid creation of huge communes, of collectivizing agriculture, Deng Xiaoping and his colleague Liu Shaoqi were holding back. They wanted to go a little more slowly, a little more cautiously than this. In the political struggles of those early decades of the People's Republic of China, Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi lost out, and of course Mao surged ahead with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution.
In 1978, the new agricultural policy was announced, whereby peasants were no longer required to pool everything and instead were responsible for the productivity of their own land. Next up, blueprint for economic reforms was also drawn up. In 1979, at the 3rd plenum of the 11th Party Congress, Deng Xiaoping's economic reform and open-door policy was formally adopted. This paved the way for the much-touted Chinese economic model. Unlike Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping never really had any ideological positions and instead was driven solely by pragmatism. And for him, all that mattered was getting the job done.
He said, if you open the window, you get flowers, but you also get fresh air and sunshine. He opened the window, he let people become entrepreneurs, he let people make as much money as they could, if they wanted to. And when you have nothing, even if you open a restaurant, things look great because now there's a restaurant and a factory and everything else. People started making clothes and bicycles and cars and everything else, and it became an astonishing success story.
For Deng Xiaoping, it was important to kickstart the economic growth. even if it meant creation of enclaves of prosperity. An economic reality that has now become one of China's biggest socio-economic problems.
Deng Xiaoping said, I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat as long as it catches mice. Communists didn't have a very good economy. They didn't have a very good anything anywhere in the world, not just China, but since Deng Xiaoping started opening up China, it's been the most successful country in the world since then. They've got the best airports in the world. They've got the best just about everything in the world because they have spent a lot of money developing their economy. And many people have gotten very, very, very rich.
In 1979, Deng Xiaoping became the first Chinese leader to visit America. Deng charmed the American public, wooed the American media, reached out to American businesses, and normalized ties with the US. His message was clear: Communist China was opening up and welcomed American businesses. On his return, Deng Xiaoping pushed the pedal on economic reform.
Yeah, people who go to China now don't even recognize the China of, the late Mao era, the early Deng era to the way it is now. When I first went to China, everyone was on bicycles. The cities at night were quiet. People didn't have cars. Only party members and government officials had cars. Everyone else was on a bus.
In 1979, China's first 3 special economic zones were created. These were located in Shenzhen, Shantou, and Zhuhai in the Guangdong province. The following year, Xiamen in the Fujian province was selected as China's 4th SEZ. These coastal regions were chosen due to their close proximity with Hong Kong, which was a thriving port economy. These SEZs were large areas that were carved out to attract foreign capital with few restrictions. Shenzhen, which was China's largest SEZ, was 320 square kilometers, or half the size of the city of Mumbai, or 3 times the area of Paris. Within the SEZs, private and foreign firms were granted attractive tax incentives and exemptions along with flexible labor laws, concessions that weren't available on the mainland. In essence, the CCP's tight grip was loosened in these 4 SEZs. In 1984, 14 other coastal cities were identified for attracting more investment. The same year, America became China's 3rd largest trading partner. Buoyed by the success of the first 4 economic zones, China soon started its 5th SEZ in the southernmost province of Hainan in 1988. The Chinese government also experimented with a variety of schemes, including setting up of free trade zones, export processing zones, free ports, and enterprise zones.
China's economy, on the path of rapid growth and development, was jettisoning socialism. Deng Xiaoping came in and broke up the communes and said, paraphrasing here, to get rich is glorious, and we're going to allow some people to become rich first. We're going to let the coastal regions develop first, and then we were going to spread the wealth to the interior. And he invited foreign firms in, and he allowed state-owned enterprises to become shareholding corporations, and people can buy shares of stock in Chinese corporations now. So employees of state-owned corporations could buy shares of stock, and then foreigners. And so all of that radically changed the Chinese economy.
In 1992, 6 Yangtze River ports were created, again meant to boost export-led growth. In a decade, China's export-led, manufacturing-driven, and coastal city-centric economic model had begun showing results. Chinese exports rose on average 5.7% in the 1980s. This jumped to 12.4% the following decade in the 1990s, and to a whopping 20.3% between 2000 and 2003. By 2003, China's export growth rate was 7 times higher than the export growth rate recorded by the entire world. These zones became so successful that China was the largest recipient of foreign direct investment amongst developing countries for almost 2.5 decades. In 1980, China received only $23 million in foreign direct investment. In just a decade, China's FDI had increased more than 30 times to $672 million. Estimates suggest during this period, it was these SEZs that accounted for anywhere between 50 to 80% of GDP growth in China. But this continued to be a period of green shoots and recovery, and the Chinese economy was still some time away from achieving scale. In fact, China and India had almost similar economic growth till 1990. 11 years after establishing its first SEZ, China's GDP was still sub $360 billion, compared to India, which was around $320 billion. By 2000, though, China had leapfrogged to a $1.2 trillion economy, and India continued to languish at sub $500 billion. The SEZs were firing on all cylinders. In 2001, 4 years after Deng Xiaoping's death, China entered the World Trading Organization, the nodal body of global trade. Till this time, China was the world's 6th largest economy, had developed deep trade links with the US, but was still yet to be interconnected with the world. Then US President Bill Clinton backed China's candidature for WTO and hoped that economic prosperity would eventually pave the way for individual freedom and liberal values in China. A hope that two of Clinton's successors, George Bush and Barack Obama, also had. But for China, entry into the WTO marked a pivotal point in its economic destiny as it embarked on a high-growth trajectory. In just 8 years, China became the world's largest exporting nation and surpassed Japan as the second largest economy by 2010. Foreign investment in Beijing mushroomed from $47 billion in 2001 when it entered the WTO to $124 billion a decade later. And in less than 2 decades of its WTO membership, China's economy grew a whopping 11 times. China proved successive American presidents wrong. It continued to ride the economic boom and did not provide any concessions to its citizens by way of personal liberty or individual freedom. It also exploited the loopholes in the multilateral trading platform that allowed it to grow so quickly. Despite being bigger than the economies of Germany, Japan and the UK, China continued to claim developing country status, while the latter were treated as developed nations. WTO allows developing countries leeway in fulfilling their commitments related to economic reforms and opening up for foreign investments.
China joined the WTO after committing to international standards of global trade. This included free currency, lower tariffs, protection of IPR, and unwinding domestic subsidies. It had a 15-year grace period to become a market economy. But most of these conditions continue to remain unfulfilled. America had championed China's entry into the WTO, but later became its biggest critic and filed 23 cases of non-compliance. Within just 12 years of China's entry into the WTO, America lost 2.5 million manufacturing jobs. It battered factory towns that were once known for manufacturing made in America, labor-intensive products.
The Chinese economy, despite its stupendous growth, continued to face severe challenges. On one end, there was rising corruption due to the compulsive involvement of local CCP leaders to ensure businesses stayed firmly under the party's grip. On the other end was China's lopsided growth. Behind its double-digit growth figures hid a dark fact about China's stark growth inequalities. obsession with port-led development caused concentration of population in a handful of cities. Over time, 51% of China moved to just 7% of land area. Unlike its vibrant eastern coast, engines of growth continue to sputter in the hinterland and the western regions of China. From the third plenum that was held in Beijing on a cold winter evening, Deng Xiaoping became a catalyst for the transformation of what was an economic backwater into the world's second largest economy. But Deng Xiaoping's legacy was not just the economy.
He also shaped China's ties with its neighbors, India and Soviet Union. Wishing for a Mao-like legacy, Deng Xiaoping was open to escalating tensions with India over Sumdorong-chu, a small area in Arunachal Pradesh. He even hinted at teaching India a military lesson similar to the 1962 defeat. In response, India, under then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, declared full statehood for Arunachal Pradesh. Since 1986, Sumdorong-chu had witnessed repeated clashes between India and Chinese soldiers. And with no breakthroughs in sight, Deng Xiaoping finally invited Rajiv Gandhi to China in 1988. This ended the long rough patch between the two countries. And 34 years after Pandit Nehru visited China in 1954, his grandson Rajiv Gandhi travelled to China to improve ties and look at a better future for Sino-Indian relations. For Soviet Union, Deng Xiaoping wished to repair the broken communist camaraderie, which had seen its nadir during Mao Zedong's tenure. Within 3 years of embracing American capitalism, Deng Xiaoping announced a policy of neutrality. It was meant to strike a balance between USA and USSR. As rapprochements began, despite opposing camps being backed by China and USSR in Vietnam and Afghanistan, the two sides managed to build bridges. And this culminated into the visit of Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev's trip to China in 1989.
Like any other CCP leader, he was averse to granting any freedom and liberty to ordinary Chinese. Following the growing inflation during the mid-1980s, student protests began happening regularly and culminated into the widespread protests in June 1989 at the Tiananmen Square. It is said over 1 lakh students had gathered at this time. What started with remembrance meeting for Hu in April 1989 by Beijing University students soon took the shape of a movement for democracy and anti-corruption. It also spread to other cities like wildfire. There were protests happening in Shanghai and other large cities as well, where students demanded freedom, liberty and greater civil rights. During the summer of 1989, even as the number of students continued to swell, the protests remained peaceful. In fact, there were factions within the CCP that felt it was incumbent upon the leadership to engage with the unarmed students who were protesting peacefully. But Deng Xiaoping felt otherwise. Deng Xiaoping felt the protest was a direct threat to the legitimacy and longevity of the Communist Party. As the head of the Central Military Commission, Deng Xiaoping ordered military response to crush the protests. On 3rd and 4th of June 1989, tanks trooped in and thousands of unarmed students that were demanding political freedom were shot down by the CCP. One man, though, became the biggest beneficiary of this massacre. He was Jiang Zemin. Deng chose Jiang Zemin as the president due to his strong-arm tactics to crush the student movement that had spread to Shanghai.
Under Jiang Zemin's watch, in the period following the massacre at Tiananmen Square, China was both isolated and ostracized. It faced sanctions, and the CCP's top leader Deng Xiaoping was no more the darling of global capitalists. Instead, an isolated China was brought on the negotiating table to resolve long-pending border disputes with its neighbors. During this period, China signed 11 boundary pacts to resolve disputes with its neighbors, including Vietnam and Central Asian countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Not blessed with extraordinary political acumen or governance skills, Jiang Zemin's legacy was not just eating humble pie as China resolved border disputes. He also happened to be at the helm at two significant moments. In 1997, when the British-administered territory of Hong Kong was returned to China, and 2 years later, in 1999, when the Portuguese returned Macau. This marked an end to 600 years of colonial rule in China. Modern-day China owes its prosperity to Deng Xiaoping. The present-day CCP also owes its continued iron grip on every aspect of Chinese society to Deng Xiaoping. He wasn't a reformist. Instead, Deng was an astute politician and followed the Singaporean model, one where individuals enjoyed growing economic prosperity without commensurate liberties. Deng Xiaoping followed Lee Kuan Yew's rule book and aspired to create a similar China. The two leaders became friends, and Deng publicly admired the Singaporean leader's governance style. What remains to be seen is that while this worked for a small city-state, how long will this work for a large country like China?